Hearing the discussion here at CERAWeek is, of course, quite interesting. Everybody's talking about AI this year. The new insights on the power needs going forward is quite daunting, yeah. And the expectations that we hear the energy consumption will go up quite significantly going forward.
Welcome to Power Map, the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program podcast, where we explore the forces reshaping the global energy system. I'm Quill Robinson.
And I'm Joseph Mikett.
So Joseph, this week we spoke to Torgeir Stordal, who is the Director General of the Norwegian Offshore Directorate. Previously, Torgeir was working in Shell's upstream business for more than 2 decades. So he's someone who's been in the private sector for a long time. He got a degree in geosciences and has a really good sense of energy markets, the business, and understands the policy how policy has evolved in Norway over the past 5-6 decades since the beginning of the boom. What were your impressions from the conversation that we had with Torgeir?
Oh, I learned a lot. He runs kind of roughly the equivalent of the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management in the United States for Norway.
Sort of plus BLM in a way, given that it's all, a lot of the resources are offshore, right?
Yeah, where all the resources are offshore. And so, it's sort of a very important role for managing what is a very valuable resource to the Norwegian economy and to the global economy. Also, we recorded it while Torgeir and I were both at CERAWeek, so I was swimming in signals about the future of the energy industry, the energy transition, and I thought our conversation with Torgeir was so fascinating because it's rare you find someone whose job is shepherding resources, talking about doing that responsibly on behalf of the sort of Norwegian nation, and at the same time is very cognizant of global energy transition and the need to use the proceeds of that energy development toward transition. I mean, it's just very mature, nuanced conversation. We don't always get that here in the United States, as you know.
Yeah, it's Norway's approach to energy and climate is quite sober. And, one of the things that I mentioned during the podcast is I'd gone back and watched a video that his directorate had released. It was kind of the 2024 wrap-up for the Offshore Directorate, and it sounded like Torgeir, the CEO, was talking to his shareholders, the Norwegian people, about how they are simultaneously developing their energy resources, but also pursuing decarbonization. Now, this brings up some interesting pieces as we think of the sort of changing policies and changing approach in the U.S. right now.
Absolutely. The very same day that we spoke to Torgeir, Secretary Burgum spoke at CERAWeek, and he talked about the notion of adding all of the natural resource wealth of the United States to the balance sheet of our country. I mean, there are states like Norway where that is actually part of the project. And in the U.S., that I'm not sure exactly what Secretary Burgum meant. We can talk about that in future episodes or in research or with him. But you could kind of sense from the Secretary a desire to manage natural resources maybe a little bit more like Norway does. I'm not sure what that looks like. It raises all sorts of political challenges. But it was interesting to then talk to Torgeir later in the day, a person deeply involved in actually doing that, right? Where the state, private companies work really closely together in a way that really does benefit Norway, provides energy around the world, is a very different model from what we have in the U.S.
Certainly, and this is something that came up in our conversation with Premier Daniel Smith, the sort of pendulum swing that happens in the United States when it comes to energy policy, from drill baby drill to decarbonization and back. There is a case to be made that having a bit more continuity in policy in the way that Norway has would be pretty attractive.
I think so. We talked a lot with Torgeir about the Northern Lights project, this, sort of nascent but about to be activated project, which is going to take CO2 from several different sources and deposit it in reservoirs.
Offshore reservoirs, right?
Offshore reservoirs, yeah. That's right. And they're sort of running the machine backwards. And there's no way we achieve a transition or a net zero economy without a lot of carbon management. And to see a country like Norway, which has high technical capacity, some room to spend some money on what is today an expensive technology, thinking about how do you create value for the world using pore space is really interesting. And that model, for a variety of technical reasons in terms of knowledge sharing, I think is really, really, really valuable that they're working on that. So it was great to hear from him about progress that's been made and the outlook that project has.
Insofar as it's possible, Norway seems to be a country that can walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to decarbonization and energy security.
Yeah, perhaps. I don't know if they chew gum in Norway. We should have asked him that.
Should have asked him. Good question. All right, Joseph, let's dive in. So today on Power Map, we have the Director General of the Norwegian Offshore Directorate, Torgeir Stordal. Welcome to Power Map. Good to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Can you help us understand a little bit about the Offshore Directorate?
Okay, the Offshore Directorate is an agency under the Ministry of Energy, providing advice to the ministry on everything from opening up new areas for activity, licensing, approval of development plans for developments go forward, as well as for data management on the shelf. We organize all the data management on the shelf, so in area management as well.
Torgeir, you've been in this position for a number of years, but I actually want to rewind a couple of decades. When you went to the University of Bergen in the 1980s, I'm curious, what was it about the oil and gas industry, the upstream industry, that was exciting for you? And what was the conversation about that industry at that time?
Well, actually, my plan was to become a science teacher, studied maths and physics, and I ended up having a master's degree in geosciences. And it was the opening of that world of geosciences which attracted me to the industry, because that was the only place at the time I could actually work as a geoscientist. But I mean, notably, many of my student colleagues, they all wanted to go into the oil industry long before I thought about it, because it was an industry that was growing and that was offering attractive jobs. But I mean, I haven't regretted a second when it's been a true pleasure to work through that. It's been so interesting, it's so developing from a technical perspective, as from a professional perspective, a personal perspective. The industry has so much to offer, both in terms of technical depth and breadth, but also the exposure you get to the commercial, to the politics, and the whole spectrum. And so that brought me through more than 25 years career with Shell.
You have a long view of this industry and Norway's relationship with the oil and gas industry. I'm curious how that relationship has evolved. It was the late 60s, early 70s, I believe, when the industry started to take off in Norway. How have you seen Norwegians' relationship with this vast, abundant resource evolve over your decades, both in the private sector, but also in government now?
Well, if you go back to the 70s, very few people knew what this could bring. So the first thing people saw was it brought jobs, yeah? It brought jobs from Norway used to be a great nation at sea, and a lot of the people working in the maritime industry moved over to the rigs. Then, of course, into the 80s, you got more of these fixed platforms that, again, offered a lot of attractive jobs to people. So I think in the early days, it was a lot about having jobs and secure and interesting job. Then later on, obviously, we've seen an enormous income to the site, partly because, of course, the way the framework has been set up. The principle is that the resources are owned by the people, or by the state, if you like, so that a lot of the wealth should go back to the people. Today, we have a pretty sizable sovereign wealth fund. We sort of started off in the 90s, and only after 2000, I would say, after the oil price picked up after 2006-07, this fund has been, so people now see this as, of course, as a huge asset as well. I think also over time, obviously, the awareness about the fund, but also about the climate is playing a bigger role. Of course, we've seen oil and gas is providing energy security to Europe. I think people appreciate that it's important, and there's a lot of pride that can actually help Europe and the energy.
Secretary Burgum, we're recording at CERAWeek, and you're here being part of this conference today. And I gave his picture of the Trump administration's view on energy. You know, you can kind of see the U.S., I would say, politically trying to mature as a large energy producer and now exporter. He talked about adding our natural resources to the national balance sheet. He talked about sovereign wealth funds. When you hear that, do you hear echoes of former days in Norway?
Well, I think a part of the job for us in our agency is to map the resources on the shelf. So every year we have to make a resource budget. And we make a production forecast for Norway. And of course, the Ministry of Finance can value onto it if they like. They can put sort of what does this mean for the perspectives for the national budget for the next 10, 30 years. Yeah. So in some way, this is recognized as an asset in Norway already. But it was an interesting perspective that you provided.
Yeah. It was, this is kind of new language for us here in the United States. So it's interesting to hear the Norwegian perspective. It's like watching a toddler learn how to walk.
Joseph, to that point, there has been some discussion of a sovereign wealth fund. I don't know how serious that discussion is in the U.S. It seems unlikely that the U.S. government would take a majority share in a major oil company, as is the case with the Norwegian government and Equinor. I'm curious, what are some of the policy decisions that you think are applicable to the U.S. context that have worked well in the Norwegian context and have put your country in such an enviable position today when it comes to energy security and the development of this resource?
I said a few things earlier about how the politicians see this is benefit to society as a whole. That's been a key principle. And the other key principle is the long-term view. The petroleum policy of today is to ensure a long-term development of the resources on the shelf. That has been fundamental, I think, and part of the role that we have played, and of course the ministry has played based on our advice, has of course been to provide some coordination to the development. It hasn't been, for example, opened up all the shelf at once and let the industry just go about it. There's been a coordinated effort and a stepwise development of the shelf. And for example, when a big discovery was made, it wasn't a development which was only going to benefit that discovery or that field. It was a development which took a broader perspective. How can we develop a hub which other can be tied into? Can we move this into a land plan which benefits the longer term? So it's a pretty coordinated effort, which I think we see the results of now, because the country now has an incredible infrastructure, both on land, in the ocean, but also towards Europe in terms of gas export. And that has been the results of a concerted effort and a coordinated effort and a joint development between authorities and industry.
You mentioned earlier the fact that you work for the Norwegian Offshore Directorate, previously the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. How much diversification are you looking at? I'm assuming this means offshore wind, maybe it means minerals, maybe it means gas. What does it mean to change the name of the program?
We have seen that there are interests to do different things on the shelf. And one of the things that started off, let's say, a decade ago was the interest for storing CO2. So that's very closely linked to looking at hydrocarbons, because you need to have a reservoir in the subsurface. Not filled with oil and gas, but ideally water-filled, because then you can inject CO2 into that reservoir. So that's in our remit. And you mentioned minerals. Part of the work that we did when we mapped the entire shelf, so there's been a program in the UN context to look at the extended continental shelves of all the countries in the world. And we started that work very early. And during that work, we started to map the deeper waters. And we have some really deep waters, like 3,000 to 5,000 meters. And in that effort, we discovered that we have mineral deposits. Over the recent years, the government has basically, there's a law now for how to manage deep sea minerals. It's a legal framework. And last year, the shelf was opened up for mineral activity. And this is governed by the Ministry of Energy, but we are actually executing the work. So we are doing all the deep sea mapping, and we're doing the resource estimates, and we will do the licensing when that starts. So those are the three main activities: oil and gas, CO2 storage, and deep sea minerals. And then with respect to ocean wind, we have a role in mapping the seabed, ensuring that there's good quality, stable seabed, and we understand the risks and uncertainties with locating the installations. But we have a different agency which looks after the electricity part of it, and of course the concessions are given by the ministry.
2 years ago, the Northern Lights Project appeared on our podcast at CSIS for the first time as an example of really smart integration and coordination from government, the private sector, and when it comes to a technology that has been difficult to deploy. Can you remind us a little bit about the Northern Lights Project? It falls into your remit, and how the status of that project is today.
The Northern Lights project was basically created out of a vision that the government should contribute to developing a full-scale value chain for CO2 capture and storage. The part of that vision was that because there was significant investment in mind, that could not be justified on storing that volume of CO2 alone. The rationale was that, well, if we can develop a project, develop technology, develop a practice, develop a REAC framework, and provide all that learning to the rest of the world, we will do it. That was the backdrop to it. And then over the years, the project has been matured. A lot of cooperation, of course, between the companies involved and the authorities. But now we are very close to operations. The plant was finished last autumn, and the wells are ready. There will be a ship to transport, and the first ship has arrived in Norway. The second one is en route to Norway, and the third one is the yards in the Far East.
Okay.
So the concept has been that there are two after-abate plants, one waste plant and one cement factory, which will capture CO2 in Norway, and then be transported by ships to this Northern Lights plant. And then from there, it will go via pipeline offshore and injected in the reservoir. So that project will be operational in the summer of this year.
And the long-term vision is that this eventually becomes a hub for much of Europe in terms of CO2 storage.
What has been supported by the authorities is the phase one of the project.
No.
And I know the owners are looking at, can we get enough commercial contract to justify an expansion of the plant? And that will hopefully be sorted out during this year.
How curious are your peers around the world about how this project is proceeding?
No, very much so. I mean, I was actually in a panel today, and there was a lot of interest, and there has been a lot of interest. And part of the commitment that the companies had to do was that we had to share the learnings. And there's a lot of that going on in conferences and seminars around the world. But there's also built a visitor center at the plant. I think there are tens of thousands of visitors over the last few years coming to this center. So to share a lot of interest globally for this. In the future, we can hope that this will be a business, but it will be a low-margin business, clearly. And at the moment, I don't think anybody has been able to sort of create a full-scale value chain that is commercial. Of course, the phase Quill Northern Lights will be the sort of first example. And we have licensed a lot of acreage for exploration.
Right.
We think we have 13 licenses now beyond Northern Lights. So there's a lot of companies trying to map out and find good reservoirs to store CO2. In parallel, they are working with the value chains, all of them coming from Europe.
Yeah. It's an incredible model. I mean, so much of the challenge of building this sort of carbon value chain is coordinating the storage tasks with the companies that are moving CO2, with the capture, and then the role of the government ensuring that all of this is above board, that accounting procedures are correct. And eventually, somebody holds the long-term liability for storing that CO2.
Clearly, when that final investment decision was made, that caused much interest because now people see it actually is possible. And this is a plant where you can actually visit, you can touch the steel, you can see it's being built, and that helps a lot. And I think where the production is starting later this year, we will see that will also catch a lot of interest.
Well, I hope to count myself amongst the visitors sooner rather than later.
Certainly. I mean, I'm also wondering about, as you see a potential stagnation or even regression in terms of regulatory frameworks and carbon pricing. Obviously, Norway is not shy when it comes to carbon pricing, but looking globally, I think the market logic is something that I'll be paying attention to as well when it comes to the viability of these carbon capture projects. I want to turn now to Europe. Obviously, Norway, along with the U.S., played a very important role in filling the gap in 2022 and subsequent years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Europe is also the region of the world that has been most aggressive in terms of the energy transition and trying to shift away from oil and gas. I'm curious, what does the relationship look like going forward between Norway, the major supplier of gas to Europe? How would Norway like that relationship to look?
Well, in many ways, it is a relationship between the gas sellers and the gas buyers, because we have an infrastructure in place. We have 9,000 kilometers of pipeline between Norway and Europe, UK. Some goes to UK, some goes to Europe. But of course, there's a lot of focus from the nations around as well to ensure that we continue delivering gas at the levels we do. And clearly, we were able to increase our production during 2022 and beyond to make up for some of the shortfall after the closure of the Russian gas import. And obviously, together with the LNG from the US, we have been able to supply adequate gas to Europe since then. Longer term, we see, of course, that the domestic production in Europe is going down. I mean, Holland is almost done, Germany is done, UK has a little bit left, but of course the domestic production is declining rapidly. And even if the demand goes down somewhat, we believe that the resources from Norway, we are basically resource constrained, not market constrained. Because our production is currently at plateau, as I mentioned, but we expect that production will start to decline basically from now on.
How do you fit that into the sort of resource management tasks that you described earlier, long-term sort of financial and otherwise sustainable management of the resources?
Our aim is to maximize the value oil and gas production from the Norwegian shelf to society. We work to ensure that is optimized. And of course, going forward, with production coming down, especially after the mid-30s, you will have to adapt the infrastructure to make sure that the unit cost is maintained at the acceptable level. And that's something that we will take part in. Of course, we took part in looking at the coordination of the development of the shelf. And of course, we will also take part in that phase that will come one day when we have to consolidate the infrastructure.
I get the sense from a resource mix perspective, but also in terms of Norway's energy strategy, your country was much better prepared for what happened over the last couple of years geopolitically and in terms of energy markets. But there's been a lot of talk in the US and Europe about sort of a return to energy realism. I mean, has there been any shift in the way that you are thinking about the energy trilemma, how to balance sustainability, affordability, that sort of thing? Because it seems like there's been a major shift in many other countries.
That's true. I think until the Ukraine war, I think energy security was on nobody's mind in the West, certainly not in Europe, because we're used to switching on the light switch. We're used to opening the gas and it was always there, yeah? So energy security wasn't on people's mind until then in this part of the world. Affordability is not so much either, because as the gas prices in Europe are not that high. From a sustainability perspective, the Norwegian gas has one of the lowest emissions in the production phase to any gas in the world. The average emission from Norwegian oil and gas is probably the lowest there is. So in terms of providing low carbon oil and gas to Europe, we are really well positioned. Because we recognize that energy security is now moving up front for everyone. The overall, it doesn't change very much for us because we are delivering gas as much as we can. We will continue to do so for as long as we can.
You mentioned the low life cycle intensity of Norwegian produced gas. What kind of activities are going on in the industry, and how do you manage and ensure that with the kind of the production is ever cleaner or as clean as possible? Is that a matter of policy? Is it a matter of technology improvement? What's the mix?
It is a matter of policy as well, because we have a CO2 tax, and that CO2 tax inspires the industry to reduce emissions, either it being in terms of being more efficient. But the main ingredient here is that we power the installations with the electric power offshore. Being a country which produces a lot of hydroelectric power, clean power, we have, I think, something like 90% plus of our electricity consumption is delivered via hydroelectric power. This power is now transmitted to the offshore installations, and that is, of course, a big part in why the production emission is as low as they are.
Interesting.
There is this very live conversation right now about long-term gas demand and mid-term gas demand around the world, particularly being driven by East and Southeast Asia. I realize that region is not your primary customer. Europe is the main customer here, but I'm really interested, given your perspective and experience in this field, how you see that discussion playing out and evolving, and if you have any particular perspectives on mid and long-term global gas demand.
It's been a lot of discussions here at CERAWeek. In terms of our role, we don't really look at the markets. The markets is handled by the ministry. So as such, I don't have a particular view of the markets. But as far as I'm concerned, for our resources, we are not going to worry about the markets because we are resource constrained. But hearing the discussion here at CERAVEEC is, of course, quite interesting because, I was here 2 years ago as well. There was nobody talked about AI. Quite a lot of people talked about AI last year, and everybody's talking about AI this year.
You can hardly escape it. Yeah.
So, of course, the new insights on the power needs going forward is quite daunting, yeah. And the expectations that we hear here is that the energy consumption will go up quite significantly going forward. If you look at developing nations as well, will of course contribute to that, no doubt about that.
Rapid potential demand growth. So then how do you think about that as a public servant, and what are the thoughts in Norway on sort of long-term strategic management of this resource? And then how does diversification play a role going forward?
There's a recognition amongst politicians in Norway that the oil and gas industry will come to an end eventually, and that production will go down, and that will obviously impact the income, although we have a pretty significant sovereign wealth fund. There is a lot of effort into looking at what is going to come after, and we are a strong energy country, as you know, and strong power. There's a lot of discussion these days about needing more power, and how can we do that? The ocean wind is certainly on the table, although, of course, the cost increases and inflation has given it a bit of a setback for the short term.
But the picture in the U.S. too.
Indeed, but the long-term view is, of course, that we can be a good host for developers of ocean wind. There's a lot of wind there, and we have a big ocean, and floating wind may be especially a very attractive option for the future, depending on how the costs develop, depending on how the markets develop. That is one leg that the government is pursuing. Wind onshore is a bit more challenged. In terms of the hydroelectric, also has been developed over the last 100 years. A lot of the areas has been developed. There is some efficiency developments, more efficient plants going on. But we will always be a strong energy nation.
Torgeir, I had a chance to watch your report that you put out last year, your 2024 state of the Norwegian continental shelf video, and it sounded like you were sort of a CEO in front of your board, but the board was the Norwegian people, and you were very frank about the developments that have happened over the last year and challenges and opportunities. I'm curious, as you are quite transparent, and you've talked about this over the course of this this discussion about there is a gradual transition that will happen. This is how we will develop the resources. In the next decade, next 2 decades, though, I'm curious what the known unknowns, challenges are that you foresee right now that worry you on that path that you have described to the Norwegian people and also to us today.
I think the most significant challenge, obviously, is that we have been used to having a lot of large fields. Some of them have been really fantastic producers. We will develop more field, more smaller accumulations, more complex accumulations. They will be more challenging. There will be probably higher operating costs. In some cases, there will be more challenging reservoirs. Will the industry be able to develop those, or will they be stranded? There will have to be a significant continued development of technology to realize some of this. That's going to be the main work going forward, to be able to work on those more challenging prospects. At the moment, we have quite a significant exploration activities in the number of wells, but it's all concentrated around the infrastructure. And if you want to find something bigger, you have to go outside. And at the moment, there's a bit of a risk aversion among the companies to do that. That's some of the challenges we are putting forward to them as well. It will be a more challenging future, but for people who work in the industry, it will be a more interesting future, because if you're a technical nerd, you want to have challenges. Yeah? So it's going to be more difficult, more challenging, but certainly more interesting as well. Over time, of course, there will be likely more focus on providing CCS portfolio. So people who work in the industry will be able to work on both hydrocarbons and CCS. And if you look at the engineering portfolio, they will some of the people who developed the fields in the 90s, and after that, they are now building ocean wind installations. So there is opportunities in that industry is almost endless in terms of what excitement you can work on. So I think there's a bright future for people working in the industry. It will be challenging, difficult, but also hugely interesting.
I want to close by asking you a question that we've asked our previous guests. Since you were at the University of Bergen studying geoscience, how has your framework changed when it comes to thinking about energy and environmental protection and the geopolitics? Have you shifted on anything? Has your view evolved?
Well, I think when I was a student, I was about 25 years old. Of course, between now and then, you learn a lot about the world. When you come out of a little bubble at university and into the industry, and I've been fortunate also to work with projects internationally, and of course you get a completely different view of what the world looks like. This was a time the Berlin Wall fell, and now we are a little bit back to that. So there's been a lot of things happening, and if you look at the global oil producers, have also changed. Yeah, I mean it used to be Middle East. I was here in Houston in 2000, and somebody from the Gas Association said in 2010 there will be no more gas produced in the U.S. How long could there be? So now you are used to be the biggest importer, now you are the biggest exporter. So there's a lot of change geopolitically, but also in the energy world. And I think I'm learning something every day, and I learned a lot just this week. It's getting more and more complex, intertwined, but hugely interesting. But certainly the mind has broadened a lot since I was 25. But it's a hugely interesting industry, and I'm so extremely privileged to have worked and still work in the energy industry. It's no better place to be.
We are very privileged to have had you on the podcast. Thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to Power Map. Please make sure to subscribe and to review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll see you next episode.